We began this series in a Canadian citizenship court, and this is where we will end it, at the place where people become citizens of the nation called Canada. This is because it was only during the period covered in this last program, the 1860s to the mid-1880s, that Canada took a major step towards nationhood and subsequently united from sea to sea, à Marie, usque, ad mare. But as we've seen throughout all of our Origins programs, Canadian history is intimately bound up with the history of many other parts of the world, in particular with the history of the United States. In fact, in order to understand how Canada became a nation, we have first to know something of the agonies the American nation was going through in the early 1860s.
Between 1861 and 1865, the United States was torn in half as 3 million Americans took to the battlefield in one of the most devastating civil wars the world has ever seen. One of the underlying causes of the conflict was this plant, cotton. By the mid-1800s, the economy of the southern states was almost entirely dependent on the cultivation of huge quantities of cotton, which made up more than 2/3 of the total United States exports. But during this period, the production of cotton required an enormous amount of manpower and depended on the labor of no fewer than 3.5 million black slaves in the South. In the northern states, the situation was quite different. Here, a variety of industries were already taking hold. The economy in general was much more diversified. So the North could afford to dispense with slave labor and piously condemn the practice. When Abraham Lincoln was elected president, largely by northern voters, he tried to prevent the expansion of slavery in the South. This raised the whole question of whether the federal government had the right to dictate the internal affairs of individual states. The Southerners claimed that it did not. And in 1861, 11 Southern states seceded from the Union to form the Confederate States of America. But Lincoln was determined to keep the country together, and soon the blue-coated soldiers of the Union Army in the North were at war with the Confederate graycoats in the South. The carnage that resulted cost hundreds of thousands of lives. But the very scale and intensity of this conflict entailed the building up of huge and very efficient fighting forces by both sides. By the time the North had prevailed in 1865 and the United States was intact once more, America possessed one of the most powerful armies on earth. The implications of this military buildup were not lost on the inhabitants of British North America. The U.S. had already attempted to invade these colonies in 1775 and then again in 1812. And as recently as 1846, the Americans had threatened to take over the northwest coast. But now, in the 1860s, they were in a stronger position than ever to invade their northern neighbors. And they were certainly in the mood to do so. Again, this was partly because of cotton. Since the British textile mills were by far the largest consumers of American cotton, Britain's rulers tended to favor the southern cotton producers during the Civil War. They allowed the South to have warships built in Britain, and even turned a blind eye when Confederate troops carried out a raid on the northern states from Canadian soil. And although many Canadians sympathized with the North and had in fact provided a refuge for thousands of runaway southern slaves before the hostilities began, It was the general pro-Confederate stance of the British that the Americans remembered. So when the war ended, it seemed more than likely that the United States would decide to strike back at Britain by invading her North American colonies. After all, the Americans had now filled in almost all the blank spaces on the map south of the border. The logical next step was to fill in the largely blank area to the north, which still only consisted of a very loose assembly of half a dozen quite separate colonies, with a total population of a little over 3 million, as compared with a daunting 35 million people in an America which was once again united and now in possession of a great army. Britain was no longer willing or able to defend her colonies against such a juggernaut. This time, if the various disconnected entities which made up British North America were to avoid being absorbed by the United States, they would have to become united themselves.
The American Civil War was the major external reason for the British North American colonies to unite. But even before that conflict had begun, a whole series of internal pressures were building up that made some sort of Canadian union inevitable.
If cotton was America's single most significant crop in the mid-1800s, the Canadian equivalent was wheat. By this period, the export of grain and flour had joined lumber as British North America's chief source of import revenue. Again, Britain was not only its largest customer, but since the end of the Napoleonic Wars, she had also made this trade particularly profitable for Canada by allowing these commodities to enter British ports almost completely duty-free. This naturally gave an enormous boost to the British North American economy. Unhappily for Canada, in the mid-1840s, Britain switched to a free trade policy, which put an end to this preferential treatment. The Canadians now felt that their economy was being cut adrift from the mother country. It seemed that their only hope of survival was to improve their trading position on this continent. But that meant meeting the strong commercial challenge of the Americans. And to do that, the British North American provinces would have to close ranks and form a united front. Here was an important financial incentive for colonial union, but there was also a strong political motivation. By the middle of the century, there were serious government problems in the United Province of Canada. This was essentially because of Lord Durham, whose scheme to assimilate the French Canadians had backfired. By recommending the merger of Upper and Lower Canada into one province, he had hoped that French Canada would eventually disappear, swallowed up in an English-speaking majority. But Durham's second major recommendation, responsible government, had canceled out the first one. This was because its net effect had been to increase the political power of the French Canadians, thereby causing the so-called United Province of Canada to continue to be split into a mainly French Canada East and a largely English Canada West. The two cultures were now more polarized than ever. This situation was complicated by the presence of two main political groups in both halves of the province: the Conservatives or Tories and the Liberals or Reformers. The trouble was the relative strengths of these two groups in English and French Canada were almost mirror images of one another, with the Reformers dominating Canada West and the Tories prevailing in Canada East. In order for the relatively weak English Tory party to get anywhere, it was forced to ally itself with the strong French Tory group. During the 1850s, two outstanding leaders of this alliance emerged: John A. Macdonald and George Etienne Cartier. But the fundamental political imbalance of the two Canadas made things increasingly difficult for the Macdonald-Cartier partnership. By the early 1860s, government had reached an almost complete deadlock. So, in addition to the military and economic pressures, there was now an urgent political pressure to find some new form of union for the two Canadas, and ideally for all of British North America. The opportunity came in 1864, when the leaders of the maritime provinces arranged to meet at Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island, to discuss a union of their own region. Macdonald, Cartier, and others hastened to attend this maritime meeting. And after a series of such conferences, agreement was finally reached to form a confederation consisting initially of 4 provinces: Canada West, renamed Ontario; Canada East, reverting to its old name of Quebec; New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia. In due course, the British Parliament passed the British North America Act, and Queen Victoria proclaimed the birth of a new federal state on July the 1st, 1867, the Dominion of Canada.
Confederation was a great moment in the history of our country. But in 1867, we were still not completely independent. We continued to be part of the British Empire. And to begin with, of course, Confederation only involved a fraction of the Canada we know today. Newfoundland and Prince Edward Island at one extreme of this continent and British Columbia at the other were still outside the new federation, as was the whole of the Northwest. And it was to this huge Northwest region that the new Dominion first turned its attention. Once again, this was largely because of developments in the United States.
The Wild West. Cowboys and Indians. This classic period of American history, when the white man battled the Indian for control of the Great Plains, began in earnest in the late 1860s at the very moment Canada was achieving Confederation. But the Great Plains take no account of political borders, and the settlers who were migrating to the American West also threatened to fill the vast vacuum of Canada's West. While this was going on, in the year of Confederation itself, 1867, the United States acquired yet another gigantic chunk of this continent that increased its territory by nearly 20%. This was Alaska, which the Russians agreed to sell to the United States for $7 million. The Canadians now had Americans to the south of them and Americans to the north of them. If they didn't act fast, they would lose the West altogether. So now it was the Dominion's turn to do some buying of its own. All the land from the Great Lakes to the Rockies was still loosely controlled by the Hudson's Bay Company. But Britain was no longer willing to continue the fur trading monopoly of that great commercial empire. And in 1869, the Canadian government was able to buy virtually all of the bay's enormous domain for a fraction of what the Americans had paid for Alaska. This whole area was then given the official title the Northwest Territories. But this land transfer had taken place without the slightest regard for the people who lived there. Not only such native groups as the Cree, the Assiniboine, and the Blackfoot, but also the 12,000 inhabitants of the Red River Colony. Those who had most to lose at Red River were the nearly 6,000 French Catholic Métis. The incorporation of their homeland into the new Dominion as part of the Northwest Territories was an obvious threat to the Métis' traditional way of life. The Métis feared, quite rightly, that hordes of English Protestant settlers from the east would now flood into the region, seizing their land and dashing their hopes of maintaining their French Catholic community in the west.